You are there, fully, completely. You show up, you stay, you give everything you have to give. And somehow it still feels like you are waiting, not for something to begin, but for someone to finally choose you. Really choose you, not because no one else was available, not because you were convenient or comfortable or close, but because out of every option in front of them, you were the one they genuinely and completely wanted most. And that moment keeps not coming, or it comes briefly and then quietly disappears again without explanation. Or you watch someone treat another person with an attention and a priority they have never once given to you, and you tell yourself you are overreacting. You tell yourself you are being too sensitive, too needy, too much, but the feeling does not leave. Because feelings that are based in something real do not leave just because you tell them to. If that experience lives somewhere in you, this video is going to explain something important about why it keeps happening. Today we are talking about why some people always end up feeling like the second choice in their relationships, and why this is almost never about not being enough. It is about something that started long before this relationship did. Let's start with what feeling like a second choice actually does to a person psychologically over time. Because it is not just painful in the moment, it does something specific and lasting to how a person sees themselves. When you are repeatedly not chosen first, the brain begins to build a story around that pattern. Not consciously, not deliberately, but inevitably. The way any brain builds patterns from repeated experience. The story goes like this: I am the kind of person people settle for, not the kind people actually choose. And once that story is installed, it does something insidious. It starts selecting for evidence that confirms it. It notices every time someone hesitates before choosing them, every time they are the backup plan, every time they wait. And it filters out the moments that contradict the story, because the brain prefers a consistent narrative over an accurate one. So the pattern does not just repeat because of bad luck, it repeats partly because the story is directing it. Now let's go back to where this story was first written, because it almost never begins in a romantic relationship. For most people who carry this feeling, the first time they felt like a second choice was inside their own family. A parent who was more present for a sibling, more proud of someone else, more interested in another child's life. Or a parent who was simply absent, not because of the child, but because of work, addiction, another relationship, grief. But children do not have the cognitive capacity to understand that absence is something separate from themselves. They understand it the only way a child can. I am not enough to make them stay. I am not enough to be chosen. And that conclusion, made at 5 or 8 or 12 years old, becomes the foundation everything else is built on. Psychologists call this an internalized rejection narrative, a deep and largely unconscious belief about one's own worthiness. And it operates below the surface of every relationship that follows, quietly shaping expectations and choices. It shapes who they pursue. They tend toward people who replicate the original dynamic, somewhat unavailable, somewhat withholding, not because they want to be hurt, but because that dynamic feels familiar, and familiar feels like home. Even when home was never particularly safe or particularly warm or particularly chosen. Let's talk about what this pattern looks like specifically inside romantic relationships, because it is very recognizable. They give more than they receive, consistently, across multiple relationships with different people who share the same dynamic. They make themselves available, accommodating, easy to be with. They do not demand. They do not push. They wait. Because somewhere in the belief system, making yourself easy to love is the closest you can get to being chosen. And they are often with people who appreciate the giving, who enjoy the stability, who value the reliability, but who never quite match the energy, who never quite prioritize with the same completeness, who are always slightly elsewhere. And the person giving everything watches this and tells themselves it will change, that they just need to give more, that if they are patient enough, present enough, loving enough, eventually this person will turn and fully choose them. But here is what psychology shows about relationships built on this particular dynamic and this particular hope. People do not usually rise to meet the level of love being offered to them. They rise to meet their own growth. Loving someone more than they love you back does not eventually produce equal love. It produces an imbalance that compounds, and the person giving more feels it accumulate. The weight of being seen but not chosen, present but not prioritized. Now let's talk about the specific moment that most people who feel this way can immediately recognize and identify. It is the moment when someone they love chooses something or someone else, and they watch it happen in real time. Not a dramatic betrayal, just a quiet, consistent pattern of being the one who moves to accommodate, never the one accommodated for. Their plans get changed, their needs get deferred, their feelings get addressed after everything more pressing is handled, and they accept it. Because they have been accepting it their entire lives, and because accepting it feels like love. Like if I can love them through their unavailability, eventually they will see how worthy I am of being chosen. But that is not how being chosen works. Being chosen is not a reward for endurance, it is a reflection of alignment. The right person does not need to be convinced to choose you. They simply do, from the beginning, without conditions. Let's talk about something uncomfortable that people in this pattern often do not want to examine too closely. Sometimes the people who always feel like a second choice are unconsciously more comfortable in that position than they realize. Not because they enjoy the pain, but because being chosen first would require something terrifying in return. It would require being fully seen, fully known, fully responsible for someone else's complete investment in them. And for someone who learned early that they were not quite enough, being fully chosen feels like a setup for the worst fall. If they choose me completely and then I disappoint them, the loss will be total. At least here I cannot fall further. So they stay in the familiar position, giving more than they receive, waiting to be chosen, safe in the painful known. This is not a flaw. It is a protection strategy, one that made complete sense at some earlier and more vulnerable point. But it is a strategy that is now costing them the very thing they most deeply want. Let's talk about what changes when someone begins to genuinely move out of this pattern over time. The first thing that shifts is not finding someone better. It is developing a different relationship with their own worth, beginning to understand, not just intellectually but in the body, that their value is not contingent on being chosen, that they do not become more worthy when someone prioritizes them. They were already worthy before anyone did. And from that understanding, the choices begin to change, slowly, not all at once, but meaningfully and permanently. They start to notice earlier when the dynamic is imbalanced, when the giving is not moving in both directions. They start to require less time before recognizing that someone is not choosing them and is unlikely to begin. And most importantly, they start to become genuinely uncomfortable with dynamics that once felt like home. The unavailability that once felt like a familiar and therefore safe kind of love starts to feel like what it actually is. Not chemistry, not depth, not the kind of love worth waiting and hoping and giving everything for. Just someone who is not choosing them, and a clear and growing understanding that that is simply not acceptable anymore. Here is what the research on attachment and relationship patterns consistently shows about this kind of healing. It rarely happens through one transformative relationship. It happens through a gradual rebuilding of the internal story. The story that says I am the kind of person who gets settled for begins to be questioned and rewritten slowly, through therapy sometimes, through honest reflection, through relationships where someone does choose them and they let it land, through the gradual accumulation of evidence that contradicts the old story until the old story loses its authority, and through the willingness to grieve what the pattern cost them, because that grief is real and it deserves acknowledgement. All the relationships where they gave everything and waited and hoped and were still not chosen first. That loss is real, but so is this. You were never actually a second choice. You were the first choice of the wrong people, and those are not the same thing, not even close. Subscribe if this finally said what you needed someone to say out loud.